The Buffalo Bills have several key decisions to make at the defensive tackle position this offseason, but the one thing they do have is Ed Oliver coming off of his best season. We're breaking down the dynamics of the Buffalo Bills defensive tackles today on Locked On Bills.
You are Locked On Bills, your daily Buffalo Bills podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Bills Mafia? It's Joe Marino, author of Go Bills and Buffalo's Run, also the co-host of the Locked On NFL Scouting Podcast, and I'm your host of Locked On Bills. Want to thank you for making Locked On Bills your first listen every day, and a big welcome and shout out to our everydayers. You know who you are. Those of you who never miss a single episode, I appreciate y'all being here very, very much. I'd also like to invite you to subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. This episode is brought to you by Prize Picks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. Well, folks, it's time to get started with the defensive side of the football with our performance review series, and we will tie a ribbon on that this week, and then we'll be able to really focus in on adding to the roster. But in order to talk about what you need, you got to talk about what you have, and so we are going to continue this thorough review of the Buffalo Bills and what they have at each position and what they need. So we're going to talk about these defensive tackles today, and at the end, we'll talk about Brandon Beane's checklist that he needs to complete this offseason to figure out a position group where there's a lot of decisions to make. So let's talk about it. We'll get started with Ed Oliver, 2019 first-round pick, number 9 selection overall, 26 years old. He turns 27 in December. He's entering year one of his 4-year, $68 million contract extension. And, folks, that contract is looking like an absolute steal. As you've seen a bunch of defensive tackles get new contracts, be it Quinnen Williams or Jeffrey Simmons or Dexter Lawrence. They came in a lot higher than what Ed Oliver got in terms of average annual value. Christian Wilkins is expected to sign somewhere in the mid-20s per season this offseason, and the Bills got Ed Oliver for 16. It's a heck of a contract extension for the Buffalo Bills, and Ed Oliver is entering year one of his 4-year, $68 million deal. Now, the Bills do have an opportunity to do a base salary restructure for Ed Oliver, and that would free up about $4 million in cap space. So that's a no-brainer. Whenever you restructure a player, you pretty much commit yourself to them longer, right? You kind of push out some of the built-in escapes from a contract, and you stay committed to them longer. A player like Ed Oliver, this is basically his age 26 season that you just signed to this contract extension that's coming off his best season. You don't have too many reservations about a base salary restructure there to free up the $4 million in cap space that you absolutely need. In 2023, Ed Oliver played in 16 games with 16 starts. He did miss that New England game, the first New England game that the Bills lost. He played 72% of the snaps in those 16 games, and that is a career high for Ed Oliver in terms of snap volume by about 12% compared to his previous high. So a lot of snaps for Ed Oliver, and you love that, right? You're committed to this player, and you want him on the field. And I know that the Bills are always going to be a defensive line that rotates a lot, but your best players should be out there a fair amount, and 72% I think is a very healthy place for Ed Oliver to land. 51 tackles, 14 tackles for loss, 65 pressures, 9.5 sacks. Ed Oliver had a great season. 4th in total pressures among NFL defensive tackles, 2nd among sacks among NFL defensive tackles in 2023. So as for his 2023 review, I mean, Ed put it all together. Big time impact, splash plays were consistent. It was very easily his best season. And what I really love about that is it came after the contract extension. Sometimes you see a player get a contract extension and then there's a decline. No, for Ed Oliver, he got the money and then he went out and performed at a higher level than we've seen before. And this, like I've already mentioned, this looks like a tremendous value contract for the Bills. And it's nice to see Ed Oliver healthy and very highly motivated. The Bills needed that this past season. As for his 2024 outlook, I think what I'm looking for from Ed Oliver is for him to show us that 2023 is the standard for what we can expect from his career moving forward, and that this is who he is. Now, the other side of that is the playoffs. He was awesome against Pittsburgh, but the Bills needed more from him against Kansas City, just like they needed more out of a lot of their defensive linemen. But for Ed Oliver to be this highly paid defensive tackle that's a cornerstone of your roster, you need that impact in the playoffs, right? In those elimination games, you want more. And you could obviously watch the Chiefs win the Super Bowl last night and see the consistent impact that a guy like Chris Jones made. And I understand that Chris Jones is a future Hall of Fame defensive tackle and certainly one of the best 2 or 3 in the entire NFL. Ed Oliver, it would be nice to see some of that show up for him in those critical moments. Obviously, against the Chargers, he closes out that game with that big-time sack on the last drive. I think I'm looking for a little bit more of that in some of those big, high-leverage moments, particularly in the playoffs, as we all want more from this defensive line in the playoffs. So Ed Oliver, pretty easy conversation. Got a contract extension. It looks like a great value, had his best season, and we're very excited about where he is as a player and his trajectory overall. Next up, and what's fun about all the rest of the players that we're going to get to, none of them are signed for the 2024 season. So Ed Oliver, your only player right now that's under contract at the defensive tackle position. So the Bills are going to have to either find a bunch of new players or hand out a bunch of new contracts, and probably a little bit of both. Next up is Daquan Jones, a 2022 free agent signing. 32 years old. He turns 33 in December. He has completed his 2-year, $14 million contract and is set to become a free agent. In 2023, Daquan Jones played in 7 games with 7 starts. In those 7 games that he was available, played 43% of the snaps, collected 16 tackles, 4 tackles for loss, 17 pressures, and 2.5 sacks. And so for Daquan Jones in 2023, his season was off to an incredible start. I mean, what he did in weeks 2, 3, and 4 against the Raiders, Commanders, and Dolphins was absolutely dominant. And the Bills go to London in week 5, and he tears a pectoral muscle, and he's pretty much sidelined until the last couple games of the season, and then he was available for the playoffs. But he did come back and play well. I'm maybe not to the level that he did earlier in the season, but I was really encouraged by what he did do when he came back. I love what he brings to this team. He's a very consistent player, although I would say that he also fell short against Kansas City in the playoffs. But in terms of a starting one technique, I think he does an outstanding job for the Buffalo Bills, and he actually gives them some pass rush juice that's pretty fun to see at that one tech position. So as for his 2024 outlook, the question that I have is he back? And I think you'd love to have him back. He's a good football player. But what's challenging here is a couple of things. First of all, his age. This is his age 32 season. He turns 33 in December. And obviously you've heard me preach all about younger and cheaper. And so I'm a little bit concerned about committing more money to older players, but also, can the Bills afford him? You know, that's a big challenge here. The Bills are $50 million over the salary cap. They're going to have to make a bunch of moves to get under the salary cap. And then from there, you know, they have a bunch of needs that they have to fill throughout this roster, and they have to sign their draft class. And there's just a lot, right? So you're probably not, you just don't have the cap flexibility to do a lot this offseason. And so if you were to extend Daquan Jones, that'd be a pretty big cap commitment potentially. One of the questions that I have about Daquan Jones is, well, what does this contract extension look like for whatever team he signs with, be it the Bills or another team? So I reached out to several people that I know who study NFL contracts and have a really good gauge on where contracts are going in the NFL. And this is what these are the different answers that I got when I asked them, what do you expect Daquan Jones' contract to be this offseason? These are the responses that I got. 1 year, $7 million, 2 years, $16 million, 2 years, $15 million, 2 years, $16 to $20 million. And then the two resources on the internet, SpotRack and Over the Cap. SpotRack has Daquan Jones getting 1 year, $6.8 million. Over the Cap projects $7 million per season. So I think this is a pretty clear set of parameters. You're seeing about on the low end, $6.8 million a season, on the high end, 10. I think that's a pretty fair range that I'd expect him to fall into. And so this is my perspective on this Daquan Jones situation. As I stated, he doesn't really fall into my younger and cheaper plan for the Bills, but they do need a starting one technique, and I really do like Daquan Jones. So here's my official position. If they bring him back, awesome. He's a really good player, and they need an answer at that spot. If they don't, well, then they needed to get younger and cheaper. But if you said to me, the Bills can bring back one of their expiring contracts, Daquan Jones might be at the top of the list. So tough dynamics. The Bills are going to need an answer at one tech. If it's Daquan Jones, can the money make sense? We'll see how it plays out. But they're either going to have Daquan Jones back, or they're going to have a hole at one tech that needs to be filled by somebody else. All right, we got a bunch more players to get to, including this Jordan Phillips, Tim Settle combination. We're going to talk about them here in just a moment, so be sure to stick with me. Prize Picks is America's #1 fantasy sports app with over 3 million members. They are the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. It's just you against the numbers. You pick more or less than the projected stats on 2 to 6 players, and then you watch the winnings roll in. It's demon time on Prize Picks. You can now win up to 100 times your money with as little as 4 correct picks. You can turn $10 into $1,000. Demons and Goblins are the newest and most exciting way to play at Prize Picks. Squares marked with red demons or green goblins get you different payouts. You can now win up to 100 times your money with as little as 4 correct picks. Prize Picks is really simple to play. I can make my picks and submit my entry in less than 60 seconds. And then when you win, the withdrawals are super quick and easy. I love the convenience, and it's just a fun platform, Prize Picks. So check it out. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, that's prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks, daily fantasy sports made easy. All right, the next player I want to get to is Jordan Phillips. In terms of how the Bills got him, well, they had him back in 2019 and 2018, and he has that big 9.5 sack season. He goes for a big contract with Arizona. Then he comes back to the Bills on 1-year deals in each of the last 2 off seasons. He's 31 years old. He turns 32 in September. His contract is expired. He completed his most recent 1-year, $3 million deal. In 2023, he played in 14 games with 9 starts. In those 14 games, on the field for 44% of the defensive snaps, collected 15 tackles, 2 for loss, 19 pressures, and 2.5 sacks. As for his 2023 review, Jordan Phillips has his occasional moments, but to me, he's a highly inconsistent player, especially as a run defender. He's missed a lot of time in each of the last 4 seasons with injuries. The last 2 with the Bills, his only 2 seasons in Arizona. And for me, I just don't find Jordan Phillips to be a consistent or a reliable football player. I think he brings some energy. You can certainly tell when he's on the field because he's going to wave his hands in the air the whole time. There's some big-time moments where he gets off the ball and can really wreak some havoc. But I think the overall snap-to-snap consistency is just not good as it relates to Jordan Phillips. Not to mention this is his age 32 season. Not to mention he's had a lot of injury problems over the last 4 years. So as for my 2024 outlook for the Bills and Jordan Phillips, I'm ready to be done here. He said in locker room cleanup day that this could be it when it comes to retirement for him. You can tell he's thinking about it. And if you're thinking about it, you got one toe in the water, it's time to go. And so if he's going to play football next year, I let him do that for somebody else. Next up is Tim Settle, a 2022 free agent signing. 26 years old. He turns 27 in July. His contract is expired. He's completed his 2-year, $9 million deal. In 2023, Tim Settle played in 17 games with 3 starts. In those 17 games on the field, 35% of the snaps. 14 tackles, 1 for loss, 14 pressures, 1 sack. As for Tim Settle's 2023 review, I feel like it's another year with not enough impact for a reasonably paid rotational defensive lineman. Now, I will say that I thought he had a pretty solid stretch of games later in the season, and I remember doing the All 22 reviews, and I share those clips with our subtext community and our Discord channel, and I was highlighting a lot of Tim Settle plays, but that was really like a 4-game stretch, and then, everything else is just highly inconsistent. To me, just not enough good from a guy that is a veteran that's getting paid about $4.5 million a season for his role as a rotational defensive lineman. So as for his 2024 outlook, this is what I'd say. If Tim Settle wants to come back for a 1-year, $1.7 million deal, this deal that they hand out to a lot of players, whether it was Taylor Rapp or David Edwards or this is Damian Harris. The Bills hand out this 1-year, $1.7 million deal, and they say, take it or leave it. If Tim Settle wants to come back for that and compete for a roster spot, I can live with that. But the whole story for Tim Settle when he came to Buffalo was all the flashes that he had playing in Washington behind John Allen and Daron Payne. And then you thought to yourself, well, what could he do with more opportunity? Well, the answer is that he could do even less. And it was really only a modest bump in snap volume compared to where he was at in Washington. So if he wants to come back for a very modest deal and compete for a roster spot, I can live with that. But if there's money out there for Tim Settle, I don't imagine there would be. I think he's probably a sub $2 million a year player. Then he can go get it. But again, if he wants to compete on a small contract, I'd be down for that. Poona Ford, a 2023 free agent signing, 28 years old. He turns 29 in November. His contract is expired. He completed his 1-year, $2.2 million contract. 2023, he played in 8 games. That's it. 0 starts. In those 8 games on the field, 32% of the snaps, collected 9 tackles, 1 for loss, 9 pressures, and 1 sack. As for his 2023 review, I was hopeful for more. I especially didn't enjoy Jordan Phillips getting a bunch of playing time over Poona Ford, especially when Daquan Jones went injured, but obviously the team saw it differently. They very clearly felt like Jordan Phillips was a better option than Poona Ford. And it seems like, based on some comments that Poona Ford made during the season, that he expected to have a whole lot more opportunity to contribute in Buffalo. I thought it was a mixed bag when he was on the field. But I would say that his consistency was a whole lot better than Jordan Phillips. And one thing that I'll point out about the inconsistency and maybe Poona Ford not coming to the expectations that a lot of people, including myself, hyped up when the Bills signed him is that structurally, the way the Bills play defense is very different than Seattle. Seattle would oftentimes have Poona Ford defending multiple gaps, playing out in a 4-eye and 5 technique alignment, right? Just a very different alignment role and structurally how they play defense, more gap controlled, where the Bills are a single gap penetration style defense. It's very, very different. And so consider me a bit unsurprised that it took a little time, or, Poona wasn't super consistent throughout the course of the season. Even look at Daquan Jones. Daquan Jones was a good player for the Bills in his first season, but obviously there was a big jump in year 2, even for a veteran player into his 30s. And that's a very similar parallel. Daquan Jones, a guy that was in gap control defenses in Tennessee and Carolina, defending multiple gaps. Now he comes to Buffalo and is a one-tech penetration style player. And now Poona Ford, you can apply a lot of that logic to him. And I would actually be very optimistic that if Poona Ford came back, there's probably a whole lot more impact that he can make as he became more familiar with the style of defense that the Bills play. And so as for Poona Ford's 2024 outlook, and being mindful of maybe Daquan Jones doesn't fit into the Bills' price range and you need a one-tech, I look at Poona Ford as a starting caliber nose tackle in the NFL. It's a pretty interesting situation. I wonder what type of money is out there for Poona Ford. Again, reminder, he signed with the Bills after the draft for a pretty small contract relative to what he did in Seattle, where he was like a 5-year starter that, had played a lot of football for Seattle. And then he winds up going to the Bills on that small deal signed after the draft and had a pretty quiet season. I don't know what his market is going to be, but I don't feel like what I just described leads to a big, robust, people lining up to sign you type market. So is there a world where Poona Ford is back? And now we know that this team values continuity. Is Poona Ford a potential inexpensive option that you can look at to bring back, but also represents some upside as I described? Because Poona Ford's been a good player, but year 2 in this scheme, does that unlock more? I'll tell you what, I'm intrigued. I'd be willing to consider Poona Ford back. Like even if you do bring back Daquan Jones, you need more depth there. But especially if you don't bring back Daquan Jones, is there another modest 1 year, $2 million deal out there to bring Poona Ford back and see if you have potentially a better fit in year 2? I think there's a realistic possibility there. So maybe it wasn't everything we wanted, but I'm certainly not closing the door on this idea of him coming back year 2 in this style of defense and him being a more meaningful contributor and potentially even a starter next to Ed Oliver. I know that might feel a little bit aggressive, but we have to get creative with how we look at this, not just this defensive line situation, but how the Bills are going to find answers in this limited resource environment where the Bills don't have a lot of resources, right? And they're going to have to find, 10 or so defensive linemen that can play. Right now, there's like 3 or 4 under contract, and one of those is Kingsley Jonathan. Another one of those is Von Miller, right? So you need to find some answers here, and maybe one of your answers can be Poona Ford coming back with a year under his belt in the scheme and in position to make more impact. I'd be willing to explore that for sure. All right, folks, stick with me here in just a second. We're going to talk about Linval Joseph and the overall checklist for Brandon Beane as it relates to the defensive tackle position. So be sure to stick with me. DoorDash went all out for game day and DoorDashed stuff from all the ads to one lucky winner, car, snacks, even tax software. DoorDash is the all-in-one app for your everyday needs, from restaurants and groceries to flowers and gifts. So next time you're running low on dinner ideas, pet supplies, or just time, you can get so much more than you realized delivered. Didn't have a chance to hit the grocery store last weekend after all the big game commotion? Or maybe your bar cart has been mysteriously cleared out. Stock back up for the week ahead with a delivery from DoorDash. Football season may be over, but we're in the thick of basketball games, the school year, and let's face it, winter. I can think of a million reasons daily to order DoorDash. Hop on the app and make your day a little easier with DoorDash. All right, folks, let's talk Linval Joseph and Brandon Beane's to-do list here for this defensive tackle position. Linval Joseph, a 2023 in-season signing. Was it like week 8 or 9 they wind up signing Linval Joseph? He's 35 years old. He turns 36 in October. His contract has expired. He's completed his 1 year, $1.5 million contract with the Bills. And in 2023, in terms of statistical production, 7 games, 0 starts on the field, 35% of the defensive snaps in those 7 games, 12 tackles, 1 tackle for loss, 6 pressures, and 1 sack. As for his 2023 review, I would say that Linval Joseph was a reasonable dart throw given the circumstances, right? Daquan Jones, pectoral injury, missing a bunch of time. Doesn't feel like you were loving what you were getting from Poona Ford. And so you brought in a veteran defensive tackle in the middle of the season to help shore up your defense. But I would say this, while it was a reasonable dart throw, I thought he played like an aging replacement level nose tackle. And in hindsight, I would have rather given those snaps to Poona Ford or even Eli Ankou, who's been a long-term fixture on your practice squad that's had some flashy moments when he's had a chance to play. As for his 2024 outlook, you have to think for Linval Joseph, he's either going to retire or do what he's done the last 2 seasons and sign with a contender in the middle of the season. Of course, the Bills this year, last year with the Eagles. So I don't think if you're going to bring back Linval Joseph, I don't know that that's going to happen until week 8, 9, 10, something like that. And I'm not sure you should want to, as he looks less and less impactful as he ages. And, I'd probably let him be somebody else's decision to make. So Linval Joseph, thanks for everything and happy trails. The Bills do have one player signed to a futures contract at the defensive tackle position. It's a familiar name, Eli Ankou, so he will be in the mix for a roster spot once again this coming off season. So here's the to-do list part. What do the Bills have? What do they need? Well, they don't have a lot. They have Ed Oliver. Well, that's great. You love to have him locked up. You have Eli Ankou as a guy that's been a practice squad player, signed to a futures contract. What do they need? They need a lot. I think first thing you do here is restructure Ed Oliver, free up that $4 million in cap space. Then you have to look at your expiring contracts, in particular, Tim Settle and Poona Ford. Is there a path where they're in the mix for sub $2 million a year contracts? I'd be okay with that. I think that's a reasonable plan for some depth, and in Poona Ford, a guy that I think can start. The next thing is, can you afford Daquan Jones? Greg Thompson of Cover One put out a tweet on Sunday about how they could structure a contract that pays Daquan Jones $7 million a season, but is really incentive-based to help with the cap dynamics. And again, the Bills need a one-tech. There's no doubt about it. I'd love for it to be Daquan Jones if the money piece can make sense. But like I said earlier in this conversation, you either need a bunch of new contracts or a bunch of new players, and potentially some of both. And so you're going to roster 4 defensive tackles, maybe 5. And you got to get there. You got to get 4 or 5 roster-worthy options. And, of course, Ed Oliver's one of them. Can you do Ed Oliver, Poona Ford, Tim Settle, a top 3-round draft pick, Eli Ankou, and a bargain bin outside free agent or 2 to kind of give yourself some options? Do you factor in Daquan Jones to that mix? The bottom line here is that there's a lot of decisions to make, and it's an important spot. It's a spot that you felt like maybe this season, especially when Daquan Jones was available, that you got the impact that you've wanted for so long out of this group. Of course, notwithstanding your game against the Chiefs in the playoffs, where the interior defensive line just didn't do enough, and certainly lost that matchup. But how do you rebuild this thing and it not be overly expensive? Because you still have questions at wide receiver. You still have questions at safety. You have still questions at defensive end. And so prioritization, being right on bargain bin, hitting on some draft picks that can contribute early, that's going to apply to a lot of positions. And, defensive tackle is one of those. And so a big task ahead. And the bottom line is you just have to be right. And whether that's bargain bins with Settle and Ford, bargain bins with guys outside the team, bringing Daquan Jones back, hitting on a draft pick, you're going to have to be right about this stuff, or else defensive tackle could potentially be a position of concern for the Buffalo Bills next season. So we'll see how it all comes together. A lot to sort out, but an important spot for this team, especially when you consider smaller linebacker core in Terrell Bernard and Matt Milano. Love those dudes, but they're smaller, right? So you want to give them as much opportunity to be able to run free and chase and be uncovered and do the things that they do. And a big part of that is stabilization of the interior defensive line. So Brandon Beane, I keep saying this to you, bud, but this is why you get paid the big bucks, and we need you to be right about your decisions at defensive tackle. All right, folks, that's going to do it for us here today on the podcast. Thanks so much for being here. Our next conversation, barring any major breaking news, will be our performance review on the defensive ends. So a lot to get into there, of course, with Greg Rousseau and Von Miller and a bunch of expiring contracts, what to do about Epinesa, what to do about Leonard Floyd. We're going to explore all of that in our next conversation. So don't miss anything. Make sure that you're subscribed. Would love it if you took a second to rate, review, and share the podcast. Have a great rest of your day. Go Bills. And I look forward to catching up with you again real soon.